As a researcher or a truth finder, if you will, one of the major things that we need to do is to keep the flame of our passion running, keep the flame up. And that could be sometimes pretty hard because we bump into a lot of research issues, etc., and sometimes we get discouraged. However, if we keep the flame running, it appears as if all the things just line up, and then at the end we'll be able to do the research or investigation that we want and we desire and we have passion for, which goes back to the way I've been doing my research for the past decade, starting pretty much with no resources, and everything just sort of lined up. And today I want to share that with you, that building a home-based / portable research lab is not as hard as we might think. So the type of lab that I was always interested in was anything related to brainwaves. And when I started 7+ years ago, at the time, the commercialized neuroheadsets were not really as advanced as they are today. And so you had two choices: either work in a lab as a research assistant with other professors, which would mean that you needed to adhere to whatever the type of research that they were doing, even if you were not interested in it, but you just tried to get into that lab just so that you could have access to those devices, or you could purchase your own. And I spent, I don't know how long, trying to figure out how I could purchase my own EEG device, and after a while I gave up on it because they were extremely expensive and not really available. And so going back to keeping the flame of the passion running, after a short period of time, when I gave up on looking for that, then I was introduced and I found out about these commercials neuroheadsets, one of them being Emotiv EPOC, for example. In the beginning, obviously, I was a little bit skeptical, thinking that, well, maybe it's because it's commercial, it's not very valid, the data is not very accurate and whatnot. But then I started reading about some of the research that other research labs had done using the Emotiv EPOC. And then I looked at those papers and the type of data that the neuroheadset was able to collect, and then realized that, no, it's actually quite accurate and basically better than nothing, because with under about $1,000, I realized that I could create my own lab. And that's basically what I did. Under $1,000, I was able to create my own lab. But the compatibility issues that existed between hardware and software was really prominent. And so I ended up creating that lab at home, but also, of course, for my grad school in lab at school as well. But because there was no EEG lab within the school that I was attending, then I ended up creating something portable so I could also take it with me to the lab that they had at school, but then having then the hardware and software that I needed to do for my grad study. And the hardware and software that I used was Emotiv EPOC neuroheadset. And then I also use EEGLAB / MATLAB, mainly because it was it's software that was pretty solid, but it was also free. So I needed to keep the cost down. And the EPOC neuroheadset, because it was commercialized, it was much less expensive than the traditional EEG devices that I was trying to get at in the past. At the time when I bought it, it was about $700 or $750. I think they're $100 or so more today, but nonetheless, it was perfect for what I needed. I ended up spending a little bit also on other things that I needed in the lab. So all in all, it was not even $1,000 that I spent. And because I was funding myself, so I was not able to get a lot of money from external funding. So for me, $1,000, even though at the time was a lot as a student, I still thought that in comparison to the traditional labs, this was much cheaper. And so in today's video, I want to share that with you, how to create your own Brainwaves lab, whether you want to do it at home or whether you want to have it as a portable entity, if you will, or research lab, if you will. So if you need to meet with clients or meet with participants outside of your home. I'm going into much more details in a book that I'm publishing in a couple of days. It's on pre-order right now, but it's going to be available on Friday in a couple of days. But here I'm just going to give you an eagle eye view as to what are some of the issues that I bumped into, and then in the book I go into much more details in terms of how to address those challenges step by step. And also I have some materials there that could potentially be very useful and helpful for you as well. One of the first things I want to mention is that the compatibility issue between hardware and software was extremely challenging, mainly because it's almost impossible to expect hardware and software that exist out there and they were created by product teams independent of one another for them to be compatible with each other. So for example, when you have product development for EPOC neuroheadset series, obviously they cannot possibly think about all different kinds of brainwaves analysis software that exists out there. And so they try to be as standardized as possible. For example, the location of the sensors that they have, although it's only 14, it corresponds to the coordinates of the 1020 system, for example, which is a standardized EEG system that is internationally available. Obviously, they also try to design their neuroheadset such that it really pertains to the need of a neuroscientist or other researchers for that matter, or even practitioners who want to do that. You don't have to be a full-fledged researcher to do that. Obviously they do that, but nonetheless it's impossible to expect them that they design a product that will be compatible to everything. So it will be our job to make sure that we figure out how that compatibility works, and if that works, how to make it work. And so the software that I used was EEGLAB/MATLAB. They have a compiled version. EEGLAB has a compiled version of their EEGLAB and MATLAB together. So essentially what it means is that you get the good of both worlds without needing to really code, but you do need to be able to. However, the compatibility issues was mainly when you're trying to import, for example, the raw EEG data that you've collected from the neuroheadset onto EEGLAB, because there are points in those interfaces between the two where you need to tell EEGLAB exactly what the coordinates of the sensors that you're importing in, where to find it, etc. And so that was one of the major challenges, because although you could import some of those files and coordinates from the Emotiv neuroheadset, for EEGLAB to recognize them exactly, sometimes it would not exactly recognize that file. And so in that book, I give you a perfect example of that file. Another challenge was, for example, if you wanted to do ERP type of research, which essentially means that when you present a stimuli to the participants and you want to see whether the brain waves changed or not. So let's say hypothetically that I'm the participants and I'm sitting there with the neuroheadset on, and then you want to see whether if I look at a picture, how my brain waves change, and you want to collect the data. And so that is called ERP, because then you're introducing something, you're poking something, and you want to see how the people that you are researching on react to it, or how their brain waves react to it, I should say. And so for that, you need to introduce something called markers within the raw EEG data set, because otherwise you won't be able to distinguish between a continuous data that you've collected and also the parts where you've actually showed, for example, the participant that particular, let's say, And so that was also another issue or another challenge that I faced when using Emotiv EPOC neuroheadset, because they have their own interface between the what you see on your computer screen and also their neuroheadset called TestBench, at least at that time. Most recently, they have launched with something called Emotiv Pro, so they are replacing TestBench with Emotiv Pro. Nonetheless, in both cases, introducing markers, introducing them was okay, but then being able to detect where in the EEG raw data those markers that you had put where, that was also a big challenge. I used TestBench for that, and it was challenging at that time. Recently, I heard from others who also use Emotiv Pro that they found that to be challenging as well. So there are a lot of workarounds around that too. And so, for example, one workaround is to use a third-party software to introduce the markers. One of them is called OpenVibe. I've used it, and I've heard others use it as well, and it's one of those third-party software that people think that it has good reviews. And so in that case, you could then use OpenVibe, which also works with Emotiv EPOC, and you could then introduce the markers into the raw EEG data using a third party. And so that was another challenge, to set that. And so long story short, all these challenges I go into in depth and in details in the book. But at this point, I just wanted to share with you an eagle eye view that you really don't need to have a lot of money to actually create your own lab if you're interested. But knowing about the challenges and being able to deal with the challenges of the compatibility issues between, in this case, EPOC and EEGLAB, setting that aside, because again, there are a lot of details that I've covered, and then you're more than welcome to look at it. But other than that, in terms of the lab setting, one of the major things that I wanted to share with you is that as long as you have a small area, it doesn't need to be a big one, that is quite quiet, or I should say isolated from any type of external stimuli, external noise, external distraction, then you should be able to create your own home-based or portal lab, in this case for EEG. And so in my case, both for my own home lab as well as a portable one that I set up, essentially all I had was my Emotiv EPOC neuro headset. And I made sure that I had the chargers, the contactless solution, because you need to damp them, you need to make them a little bit hydrated to get better connectivity. And also, obviously, I had my own laptop. And on my laptop, I had already installed EEGLAB / MATLAB, TestBench, Emotiv Pro if you have that, charger, and etc. Those basically are the main two things that you need. And if you have set up everything, you should be good to go. I also made sure that I always had baby wipes with me, because when you put the neuroheads, especially in the prefrontal lobes and sometimes in the temporal lobe as well, is that the skin of the participants, sometimes it's greasy because we use lotion, or maybe sweaty, or some people have makeup on, or maybe a lot of hair. So having baby wipes, and of course asking the participants before I touch them whether it was okay if I touched them, but cleaning up their forehead actually really helped. I also always had a hairband in case there was a lot of hair that I need to sort of put back, because one of the major things, the first thing that we need to make sure of is that the connectivity must be crystal clear before we even start. And if we, for example, have issues with putting the sensors very, very close to the scalp, or if there's too much, for example, makeup on and things like that. Not only will you potentially destroy your sensors, but also you might not get a perfect connectivity. So you want to think about those things as well. Consent form was another thing that I always had with me. So I had like a bag of a purse, a big bag of, let's say, consent form and the baby wipes and pens and papers and whatever I needed. I also made sure that I always had some water and some snacks as well. Some labs don't give permission for us to bring in food and water, but if they did, I had some with me, because not only for myself, but sometimes my participants, needed it as well. Another thing that was really helpful for me, it was to do a dry run. Some people call it pilot, but dry run essentially is something that you can pretty much ask anybody, friends, family, whoever, neighbor, and do a very informal test with whatever you want to test in the lab. And the reason that was really good was that because when you run a session, you usually have a protocol. For example, step 1, step 2, step 3, and hopefully you've printed it out. At least that's what I did. But then once you do a dry run, you usually bump into a bunch of hurdles, and those are the perfect moment where you could sort of pause and then take notes and see what is it that you need to improve on in terms of your protocol. So having done that as well really helped to have a smooth lab session, because last thing you want when you are in a lab and you're running a lab session is to bump into a bunch of hiccups, because the time of the participants is very very important, and I'm sure you know that it's not easy to get participant to show up somewhere, or maybe even having them visit you. And so you really want to use that hour or two that you have with a participant to best way possible. So those are just some of the basics in terms of having your own lab session. Obviously, if you are trying to build a home-based lab, you don't need to think about a lot of things that you need to carry, because you always have your consent form there and whatnot. But if you're thinking about portable, then you really need to think. Another thing I want to mention, that if you are trying to build a home-based lab or a portable one, it's very important to be as sensitive, if you will, with the participants, because when we run a normal study, we're not really necessarily touching the participants. But when we are running EEG studies, we are going to be very close physically to the participants, not to mention the way we're going to touch their hair. Sometimes their hair, they have a lot of hair, so we have to like touch them a lot. And you have to, sometimes the sensors, they don't sit well. And if you look at your test bench or your Emotiv Pro, and then the signal is red, for example, you know that the connectivity is not in a good quality. So you need to really touch the sensors a lot. And so being sensitive about the fact that we will be touching the participant a lot helps for us to set the stage. So one thing I noticed was that helped me was that not only was I very clear in my email conversation before them coming to the lab or before me visiting them, but also even before, when they were in the lab, before we even started the session. I went through all that, and I did mention on several occasions that, hey, I'm going to be touching you. If you're sensitive, let me know. I'm going to be very gentle with you. Is there any problem for me to touch you? Is it okay if I touch you here? Things like that. And I always made sure that they knew exactly what was coming, because some people are sensitive and they just don't want to be touched. So we need to be aware of that. Another thing is that once the sensors are hydrated, when you put them initially on the skin, they feel a little bit cold. And so I would also always tell them that, hey, this is how I had to hydrate the sensors. Here's why I had to hydrate the sensors. Here's what I use. And I would even show them the contact lens solution that I had, that it's nothing dangerous, that it's being put on their head or on their scalps. And I would also mention that, hey, now I'm gonna put the sensor on your scalp. It's gonna feel a little bit cold. So, you know, again, a little bit like when you go to the doctor's visit and they want to examine you. The good doctors, at least, they tell you ahead of time that it's going to feel cold or whatever. So it's really, I saw it as my job to really forewarn them every step. Another thing that really helped also, having these home-based lab, was to really let the participants about the sensitivity of the data. Because essentially anything that we do, even if we are sitting totally still, just an eye blink, basically, essentially it creates a brainwaves. And so depending on the type of studies that you're doing, it's very important to let your participants know that whatever they do, it's going to elicit brainwaves. So asking them to be as still as possible. If they need to move the mouse or anything, that they do it, you know, that they use as small movement as possible. The fact that they should not be speaking to you at the time also really helps. So that's why I always said, hey, whatever we need to talk about, let's talk about it now. But once the session is in works, then I need you to be very quiet. To emphasize again, you don't need to break the bank to create your own brainwaves lab, home-based or portable one, thanks to all the recent developments when it comes to brainwaves. I'm really excited about the space, because that just means that more people have the opportunity to do actually their own research, and God knows we need it, because in my opinion, we don't have enough research on brainwaves. We have a lot of research on the physical brain, but not so much on the invisible or non-physical brain, if you will. And so I would love to hear your feedback. If you get a chance to look at my book, feel free to go through it. I want to improve it as we move forward. And if you have any suggestions or more feedback, let me know. It's going to be on Amazon, and I'll put the link down in the below this video. And yeah, that's all I had for today. Thanks for watching. Take care. Bye.